The Arctic wind screamed through the frozen expanse, rattling the walls of a lone wooden cabin buried beneath thick layers of snow. The sky, an endless stretch of dark and gray, promised another brutal storm before the night was through. Inside, Eleanor Thorne, a 72-year-old widow, sat hunched in her rocking chair by the dying embers of the fireplace. The flickering light cast deep shadows over her weathered face, the lines of time etched into her skin like the marks of an old tree. Her hands, though calloused from years of hardship, moved with practiced ease as she stitched a patch onto her worn coat. A pot of stew bubbled weakly over the fire, its scent barely strong enough to mask the cold seeping through the cracks in the cabin's wooden walls. Supplies were running low. It would still be weeks before the next delivery arrived from the nearest outpost, if the weather allowed it. But hunger wasn't what unsettled her tonight. It was something else. A feeling, a whisper at the edge of her senses, telling her she was no longer alone. Then it came, a low, ragged groan, barely audible over the howling wind. It was deep, guttural, not human. Eleanor stiffened, her breath caught in her throat. She placed her stitching down carefully, listening. The wind shrieked against the walls, but beneath it, she heard it again, closer this time. A wet, rasping exhale, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy collapsing into the snow. Her pulse quickened. Slowly she reached for the old hunting rifle mounted above the door. The wood was cold beneath her fingers as she pulled it down, her movements steady despite the growing unease curling in her gut. She had lived alone in this wilderness for years, far from civilization, surviving on instinct and experience. She knew the sounds of the land, the distant calls of wolves, the shifting ice, the cracking of trees, and the relentless cold. But this was something dying. With a deep breath, she pulled on her heavy coat, shoved her feet into thick, fur-lined boots, and unlatched the cabin door. A blast of freezing air struck her like a solid force, biting through the fabric and chilling her bones. The world outside was a vast, white abyss. Snow swirled violently in the wind, limiting her vision to just a few feet ahead. Then she saw it. A massive shape lay sprawled in the snow, just beyond her porch steps. The bear was enormous, its dark fur stark against the ice, but it was its stillness that sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. It wasn't moving. She took a cautious step forward, tightening her grip on the rifle. Her breath came in short, visible puffs as she neared the creature, boots crunching softly against the ice. The bear's massive body was riddled with wounds. Deep gashes marred its flank, dried blood crusting around the torn fur. Its breath was shallow, uneven, each exhale coming with a weak, shuddering effort. It was dying. Eleanor stood over it, rifle at the ready, heart hammering against her ribs. This was nature's way. The weak did not survive the Arctic. She should turn back, let the wilderness take its course. And yet, she hesitated, because in the dim light of her cabin's lantern, she saw something in the bear's dark, half-lidded eyes. Not fear, not aggression, but exhaustion, pain, a silent plea. Eleanor let out a slow breath. "This is madness," she muttered under her breath. And then, against every instinct screaming at her to leave the beast to die, she made her choice. She bent down and reached out, and the dying bear, for the first time in its life, let a human touch it. Eleanor's gloved fingers pressed against the bear's coarse fur, sticky with half-frozen blood. Beneath her touch, she could feel the ragged rise and fall of its chest, shallow, weak, but still alive. A sane person would have walked away. A sane person would have let nature take its course. She wasn't sane. Or maybe she had just lived too long in this frozen wasteland to fear anything anymore. The bear was too heavy to move by herself, and leaving it outside in the open was a death sentence. The storm would only grow worse as the night deepened. Wolves would come. She had to act fast. Eleanor turned and trudged toward her tool shed, where her old wooden sled lay buried beneath a tarp. It was meant for hauling firewood from the tree line, but tonight it would serve a different purpose. She dragged it through the snow, her breath coming in short puffs, her joints aching from the effort. The bear let out a deep, rumbling groan as she worked, but it didn't fight her. Maybe it was too weak. Maybe it knew there was no point resisting. It took all her remaining strength to roll the beast onto the sled. As she tugged on the ropes, hauling it toward the storage shed, her legs threatened to buckle. The sheer weight of the bear made the journey agonizingly slow. Sweat beaded at her brow despite the freezing wind clawing at her face. Every step felt like dragging death itself. By the time she reached the shed, her arms were shaking. The door creaked open, revealing the small, insulated space where she kept her preserved meats, fishing gear, and extra firewood. It wasn't warm, but it was shelter. She guided the sled inside and collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. The bear lay motionless, its sides rising and falling in shallow pants. Eleanor pulled off her gloves, her fingers aching with cold, and reached into her supply crate. She fished out a bottle of vodka, not for drinking, but for what she had to do next. She needed to clean the wounds. Her late husband had been a hunter. He taught her how to stitch a wound in an emergency, how to treat infections with whatever they had on hand. She never imagined she'd be doing it for a bear. Grabbing a clean rag, she poured the vodka over it, soaking it through. The sharp scent burned her nostrils. "This is going to hurt," she muttered under her breath. She pressed the rag against the first wound. The bear jerked violently, letting out a guttural snarl, its body seizing for a moment before collapsing back against the sled. Its breath came in short, sharp bursts, but it didn't lash out. Eleanor kept working, methodically cleaning each gash, pressing cloth against the bleeding wounds. The entire time the bear remained still. Something about that stillness unsettled her. It was watching her. Not just enduring the pain, but observing, learning. By the time she finished, her hands were shaking. The bear's breathing had steadied, but it was still too weak to move. She had done all she could. Now, only time would tell if it would survive. Eleanor sat back, her tired eyes lingering on the beast. It should have been dead by now. Any other creature would have succumbed to the cold, to the blood loss. But something about this bear told her it wasn't ready to die. Neither was she. She exhaled and reached for an old wool blanket, draping it over the animal's massive form. It was foolish. The bear had fur thick enough to withstand Arctic winters. But still she did it. And for the first time in years, as she sat beside the slumbering beast, listening to the storm rage outside, Eleanor didn't feel quite so alone. The storm howled outside, rattling the walls of Eleanor's cabin. Snow piled against the windows, sealing her inside a frozen tomb of ice and wood. But her mind wasn't on the storm. She sat on an old wooden stool in the storage shed, her lantern casting a flickering glow over the injured bear. It had been 12 hours since she dragged it inside. She expected it to be dead by now. But against all odds, the bear still breathed. Its massive chest rose and fell in slow, labored movements. The wounds had stopped bleeding, though the matted fur around them was crusted with dried blood. Eleanor watched the beast with cautious eyes. Even in its weakened state, it was powerful. A single swipe of its paw could crush her skull. And yet, it hadn't attacked. She wasn't foolish. She knew animals, knew that instinct ruled them. But something about this bear was different. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and exhaled. "You're stubborn," she muttered. "Like me." A heavy silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind screaming through the cracks in the wood. Then, a sound. A low, guttural rumble vibrated from deep within the bear's chest. Eleanor froze. Its eyes opened. For the first time, gold met blue, ancient, weary eyes locking onto hers. She should have felt fear. Instead, she felt something far more unsettling. Recognition. The bear didn't move. It simply watched her, its breath slow but steady. The silence between them felt deafening. Eleanor, ever so carefully, reached toward a small tin bowl of water she had set nearby. She nudged it forward with the toe of her boot, just within the bear's reach. The beast's nostrils flared. Then, to her astonishment, it shifted. The movement was weak, strained, but deliberate. It stretched its massive neck forward and lapped at the water, slow and methodical. Eleanor exhaled. It wasn't much, but it was something. The bear was fighting to live, and for the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt something stir inside her, a reason to keep fighting too. Over the next few days, the bear's strength began to return. It wasn't quick. The wounds were deep, and healing in the bitter cold was never easy, but it held on, stubborn as the frozen land around them. Eleanor cared for it in small ways. She changed its bandages, brought it water, even left bits of food near its resting place. At first, the bear barely touched anything, but then one morning, she found the food gone, and she realized something. It trusted her, not fully, not completely, but enough to let her near, enough to accept her presence. Eleanor wasn't sure what to make of it. She had spent years in solitude, with only the wind and the wolves as company, and now she was sharing her space with a dying bear that refused to die. She sat by the fire that night, staring into the flames, listening to the rhythmic breathing from the shed. For the first time in years, she didn't feel entirely alone. But peace never lasted long in the Arctic, and something was coming, something that would test them both. The first sign was the howl, long, low, and too close to the cabin. Eleanor set her cup down, her heartbeat quickening. She knew that sound. Wolves. They had caught the scent of blood. She grabbed her rifle and stepped outside, the cold instantly biting at her skin. The sky was an endless stretch of black, snow falling in thick, silent waves. Then she saw them. Yellow eyes gleamed in the darkness, moving like shadows against the snow. A pack. They were hunting, and they were here for the bear. Eleanor's grip tightened around the rifle. The Arctic was ruthless. It didn't care about sentiment or survival stories. The wolves had sensed weakness, and they were here to finish what nature had started. The bear was still healing. If they attacked now, it wouldn't stand a chance. Eleanor took a slow breath and raised her gun. Not tonight. The first shot rang through the night. The wolves scattered, startled by the sudden explosion of sound. But they didn't run. They knew she was just one woman, and she only had so many bullets. One of the larger wolves stepped forward, its fur bristling, lips curled back in a snarl. Eleanor stood her ground. Then, a sound from behind her, a deep, rumbling growl. The bear. It had risen to its feet. It wasn't strong yet. Its movements were sluggish, unsteady. But it stood its ground beside her. The wolves hesitated. They had come for an easy kill. But now the odds had changed. Eleanor raised her rifle again. The pack leader took one last look at the bear, then at her, and then they turned back into the night. She exhaled, shoulders sagging. The bear did the same. For a brief moment, they simply stood together, side by side, watching the wolves disappear into the darkness. The message was clear. They weren't alone anymore. The storm came without warning. One moment, the world was silent. The sky a canvas of pale blues and grays, the wind whispering through the barren trees. The next, the Arctic unleashed its full fury. Eleanor knew storms. She had survived many, but this one was different. The wind roared like a living thing, hurling sheets of ice and snow against the cabin walls. The roof creaked, the wooden beams groaning under the pressure. The small fire in her hearth flickered, barely holding on. And outside, the bear was still in the storage shed. Eleanor grabbed her coat and pushed against the door, but it wouldn't budge. Snow had piled against it, sealing her inside. Panic set in. The bear. It was still weak. If the shed collapsed, if the storm raged through the cracks, it wouldn't survive the night. Her breath came fast, visible in the frigid air. She had to get to it. She grabbed a rusted shovel from the corner and started digging. Snow burned her fingers through her gloves. Her arms screamed in protest, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Her vision blurred. Her body trembled. And then, a sound from the other side. A deep, heavy thud. Eleanor froze. The door shuddered. Again, another impact, stronger this time. And suddenly the door burst open, nearly knocking her backward. The bear stood there. Snow clung to its matted fur, ice crusting around its wounds. Its massive shoulders heaved, its breath coming in ragged bursts. But it had forced the door open from the inside. For the first time, Eleanor saw something in its eyes that she didn't expect. Determination. She swallowed hard, chest rising and falling. "You!" Her voice cracked. "You're stronger than I thought." The bear huffed, shaking snow from its fur. Then slowly it lumbered forward, not toward the wilderness, but toward her cabin. Eleanor stepped aside as the beast moved past her, its massive frame ducking through the doorway. And just like that, they weathered the storm together. Days passed. The storm had buried the world under feet of snow, but they had survived. The bear moved freely now, its strength returning. It still carried the scars of its injuries, but its movements were no longer sluggish. Eleanor watched it from the porch as it paced near the tree line. Something in her chest tightened. She knew what was coming. The bear was healing. It was only a matter of time before it would leave. And yet, it never strayed far. Not yet. One afternoon, Eleanor set out with her axe to gather firewood. The cold gnawed at her fingers, her knees aching with every step. She wasn't as strong as she used to be. She swung the axe, the sharp crack of wood splitting through the silence. Again, again. Her breath grew ragged, her arms trembled, and then her vision blurred. A wave of dizziness slammed into her, sending her stumbling. She barely felt the snow as she collapsed. Her chest burned, her limbs useless. Her body had finally betrayed her. For the first time in years, she felt true fear. But before the darkness swallowed her, a shadow loomed over her. Warmth, strength, a presence she knew. A deep rumble, followed by the scrape of something heavy against the snow. And then, she was moving. The bear was dragging her. She wanted to speak, to protest, but the words wouldn't come. Her body felt like ice. Through half-lidded eyes, she saw her cabin door swing open. The world spun. Then, darkness. Eleanor woke to the crackling of fire. Warmth. The air smelled of burning wood and fur. Not from an animal, but from something curled near the flames. She turned her head. The bear was there, resting on its side, its body stretched close enough to shield her from the cold. A heavy silence filled the space. Eleanor swallowed hard, her throat dry. "You saved me." The bear didn't move, but something in the way it breathed, the way it remained close, told her it understood. She had saved it once. Now it had saved her. Her vision blurred, not from exhaustion, but from something deeper. For the first time in years, she wasn't alone. She reached out, fingers brushing against the thick fur, and the bear let her. Spring came slowly to the Arctic. The snow thinned, the ice cracked, and Eleanor knew. It was time. She stood at the edge of the woods, staring at the bear standing just beyond her porch. It was strong now, stronger than ever. It had every reason to leave. And yet, it hesitated. For the first time since this all began, Eleanor's heart ached. She had never imagined she could feel this way about a creature born of the wild, a creature she should have feared. She swallowed, forcing the lump in her throat down. "You don't belong here," she said softly. The bear tilted its head, golden eyes locking onto hers. Then, it stepped forward. Not away, not toward the wilderness, toward her. Eleanor's breath caught. The bear lowered its massive head, pressing its forehead against her palm. A final moment of understanding, a choice made, not by instinct, but by something deeper. Then, it turned and disappeared into the wild. Eleanor watched until it was gone. The wind whispered through the trees. For the first time in her life, the silence didn't feel empty. Because some bonds never truly break.